Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Great to have you here for this episode. We have a special guest that we will have introduce himself in a minute, but just to remind folks of who we are, or maybe this is your first time tuning in and you'd like to know. So I'm C.R. Wiley. I serve a church just outside Portland, Oregon in the PCA, and I've written a number of things, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I'm a theologian and ethicist. I teach both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I do ordained ministry as well at a little ACNA church here in Connecticut.
Okay, Glenn.
Yeah, and I am Glenn Sunshine. I am a professor emeritus of European history, specializing in the Renaissance and Reformation period at Central Connecticut State University. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I've got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries, and you can find me at esquareinch.org or on Substack.
And we are pleased to be joined today by Paul VanderKlay. Paul, great to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
It's great to be here. I'm a third-generation minister in the Christian Reformed Church of North America. I pastor a church in Sacramento, California. About 8 years ago, I started playing around with YouTube, and from that, a whole bunch of other unexpected things happened. So I've got a lot of funny little things I do in my life now.
Well, we had Annie Crawford on here a little while ago, and she talked about one of those funny things, which sounds kind of great, and we'd like for you to talk about that. But I'm going to kick it over to you, Glenn. Why don't you just go ahead and steer the boat here for this episode?
Okay. Well, I thought I'd like to start off just briefly by digging into your background a little more as somebody from New Jersey.
We feel bad for you guys.
Well, you'll notice neither of us are still there.
I still have to drive through it once in a while.
So, your background. You mentioned you're a third-generation CRC pastor. I actually taught at Calvin College and was in the CRC for a while myself. But you also did some missions work.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. I was a missionary with Christian Reformed World Missions in the Dominican Republic for about 7 years. So I did that right after seminary.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's a pretty neat place to go. I mean, a lot of great baseball players come from the Dominican Republic.
Well, if you saw what they played in the slums, you'd know why they could easily hit a baseball from what they're used to hitting.
I bet.
So okay. So you've got a background growing up in the church, seminary, missionary, and then you began pastoring in the States.
Yeah.
Did you start? Is Sacramento your first church?
Sacramento is my first church in the States. Yeah.
In the States. Yeah. Okay. Good. Now, as you moved into YouTube, I mean, I've watched your introductory video and some other things, and there's sort of a rocky, bumpy start there. But why don't we move to the point where things started going viral with Jordan Peterson and your connections there?
Yeah, so, it was in 2017. I learned about Jordan Peterson. And I thought it was strange what was happening around him. I thought it was especially strange that people who had sort of been taking the road to new atheism or taking the road to new age things start sort of coming back down that road because of Jordan Peterson. And I saw people in comment sections talking about, I'm interested in the Bible again, and I'm curious about church. And I thought, they're going to have a hard time figuring that stuff out. And so I was playing around with YouTube with a member of my church. We have the thing called the Freddie and Paul Show. And so I thought, I was also rereading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death at that point, and thought there's something going on with YouTube. And I'd never used YouTube for anything but the Freddie and Paul Show and a few other little things. And so I thought, well, I'll make a video because Jordan Peterson had started his biblical series. And I thought, well, I'll do some commenting on his biblical series. And that took off, much to my surprise. And what really began happening behind the scenes was that people were contacting me and wanting to talk to me. And because, of course, I'm a pastor, I would just talk to them. And very quickly, I had a lot of people wanting to talk to me. And so often I would have a conversation. I was very early started using Zoom because you could record the conversation. They would come back and say, well, what did you say about such and such? I don't remember what I said. I talked to 12 people this week.
Yeah.
And so we'd record the conversation. I'd send them the recording. And then after a while, I thought, what if I posted some of the appropriate conversations onto my channel? And that really got the ball rolling. And what started to happen was we were just having random people on the internet having conversations about Jordan Peterson, about meaning. Fairly quickly, I got acquainted with Jonathan Pageau, who was a personal friend of Jordan Peterson and working in a similar space. So we struck up a relationship. Similarly with John Vervaeke, a cognitive scientist out of University of Toronto. And so we struck up a relationship. And then I was doing these Jordan Peterson meetups and helping other people start these meetups because I saw that there was a lot of one-dimensionality, people getting information from the screens, and had difficulty finding other people, with whom to process this information. So we were starting up Jordan Peterson meetups in different parts of the US and the English language world. And then Jordan Peterson sort of went away because of his health. And also the meetups sort of bottomed out because there was just too much grievance and complaint in the conversations. So myself and a friend of mine who was a former CRC minister, John Van Donk, in Southern California, we developed what we called the Estuary Protocol, which was a way that a group of people could come together and start a conversation that had a high probability of being a satisfying conversation for those people based on what the group itself in that moment wanted to talk about. So then we started to shift these Jordan Peterson meetups towards estuary groups. And estuary was an image that I had because after 20-some years of pastoring in a distressed neighborhood with everyone wanting help for gas, help for rent, help for electricity, I really wanted to have better conversations with people, and I wasn't having that. And so estuary was sort of an image of the fresh water meets the salt water. And so then we started doing these estuary groups. And also we had done one conference with myself and Pageau and Vervaeke in Thunder Bay, Canada. And that was sort of a straightforward conference. But then in Chino, California, we decided we really wanted to do something different, where John and Jonathan and myself would do some things on stage, but we would also dedicate significant portions of the time to using this estuary protocol with small groups. And we would start the conference in small group mode rather than plenary mode to at least get individuals coming to the conference to have a little sort of like college orientation, a little group of people to begin. So they weren't going through the conference alone. So when they would hear ideas on stage, they would already have a group to start processing these things. And so the combination of the randos conversations on the internet sort of became a network of other channels doing these conversations on the internet. And then the in real life, both local estuary groups plus bigger conferences, that sort of rolled into something of a movement where people both sort of start their own little estuary groups, but some people want to do a conference. And of course, there's a lot more involved in that, but we kind of help them get an idea about how they can actually pull this off. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about the star power on stage, because what people really leave the conference with is what they've developed in their little group.
That's pretty neat. This is a new sort of thing for me to think about. How long has it been going on now, Paul?
We had our first conference in Thunder Bay in 2022. So we're going to do that. And we started a tour of the meetups in February of 2020 going into March. And we all know what happened in March of 2020.
Yeah. By the way, I have a friend who was at that Thunder Bay conference. So, it's actually through him that I found out about you and several other people. So,
okay.
I have a quick quick kind of, I guess, comment or kind of response to that is we've seen similar things. I mean, I think our own podcast started in a situation, not the same, but definitely one where conversation was happening that was needed. I mean, it was a theology group that was meeting here, but people would come out and have these conversations. And there is, I think, especially since the university where I kind of spend a lot of my time, those conversations they don't happen. I mean, I remember from even just my days of spending time after class with other students talking about the material, engaging it. These things are not going on. If they're having conversations, they're very superficial, and they're almost scared to push things beyond that. So in a way, what you're doing is creating environments for that and friendship to develop, which I think, as Aristotle and others would teach us, much less our own faith, friendship is essential to learning these kinds of things.
I completely agree. And I think churches are actually poised right now to be able to work on this. So I talk about estuaries being church adjacent.
Yeah.
I noticed in churches that if you're sort of in a Bible study and you don't know a lot about the Bible, you can lose status by asking a stupid question. I wanted a group, so we don't open with prayer. We have some people that are not Christians at all. They participate in this. Others are Christians. And I also think that this has to do with the revolution that YouTube is bringing, because it used to be that having a well-crafted message from a person who's prepared is a rather unusual thing, and you had to go to a place in purpose. Television was sort of mass audience, but now with YouTube, where you can find almost any kind of theological or biblical or ideological position out there, kind of the Protestant posture of presentation is basically overwhelmed by content. And so I actually think the value that people are going to increasingly get in church is the communion of the saints. And then the question is, how do we facilitate that? And I think, churches are well practiced with this, with Bible studies, small groups, things of this nature. But I don't know that we've done well hosting conversations where non-Christians can come in and basically freely explore whatever it is they want to explore.
Yeah, it reminds me of some things that, in the past were church-related. I'm thinking about E. Stanley Jones and his ashram movement in India. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a little bit like that, but not the same thing. But this is a very Socratic kind of approach too, where the conversation, is unscripted. In other words, you can go anywhere, and so you have to be this sort of person who's pretty good on your feet and has at least a modicum of knowledge on a range of things. And sometimes I don't think we prepare our guys in seminary for that kind of thing. They're used to a monologue where I get up, I talk, and you just listen. It's maybe much more like the Black church, where there's actually a dialogue going on even during the sermon. Anyway.
Not a lot of a dialogue. It's usually amen. And that's what a lot of preachers really want to hear.
Right.
I get it. Yeah, I'm with you. I stand corrected.
So you talked about the Estuary protocol. Can you and I think we've gotten a little bit of the information about that already, but can you summarize what some of the key points are?
It's super simple. It's basically 4 rounds. The first round is everybody introduces themselves. The second round is everybody or anybody who wants to pitches an idea to the group about where to begin the conversation. It can be something intellectual, can be something contextual, something going on around them, can be something personal, can be something estuarial. It has to do with the group. So they pitch an idea to the group. Now, the real key here is the third round, where everybody in the group points to an idea other than their own and says, what you said caught my interest, or maybe these 2 ideas, I see a connection. Because what that does is leans the group in to listen to each other.
Yeah.
And where I think we are awash in talking faces, pastorally, I know most people are starving for a listening ear. And so what happens in that moment is someone has heard me and they've taken my idea seriously. And then we sort of tally who had sort of the most, what idea had sort of the most people pointing to it. And then we play and the conversation begins and we just have the conversation. So it's super simple.
That's great. And now, what comes to my mind immediately, and I'm sure you've dealt with this as a pastor, is the guy who just can't listen, who shows up and wants to dominate the conversation. What do you do in those kind of situations?
So usually what happens, the first question I get with this is, well, what happens when someone comes in and they want to talk about Trump or Gaza or some hot button issue that's going to derail the conversation? What happens with the group is that someone will say something, something happened in the news. I want to talk about this. And everybody else in the group knows they don't want to talk about that. And so when it comes to sort of the voting about what they talk about, those issues almost never get picked up. And what usually wins, especially over time, I run this group every week on Sunday morning at church before our service. And almost always, that the group is really hitting something when the conversation gets personal. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need a good small group facilitator to basically help. Sometimes people need a little calming down and pull some of the other people out. Yeah. But one of the nice things about churches are that churches tend to have a lot of experience facilitating small group conversations. And they tend to have a lot of rooms set up to have small group conversations. And again, this is a reason why I'd really love to see a lot more churches become spaces culturally where people would look at a church and think, okay, maybe I can get some help with food. But maybe I could go there because I'd really like to talk about some things. And I think for the church to be in that space, in the culture at this time, I think that's exactly where we want to be.
Yeah, that's great. Again, I'm running to the practical questions of, how do you develop leaders who are capable of that sort of facilitation, that sort of moderation?
Well, we had one of the things we started early on was basically a leadership training program where we do it over Zoom, where someone can go to estuaryhub.com and sign up and get invited to a Zoom meeting where you have all of these estuary leaders in training working on their skills. And some of those are some of those chatty people, highly motivated people like you just mentioned. And so basically what they do on those groups is they practice the estuary protocol and they practice online with the group. And then they also get to share about, I'm having trouble getting my group going. What can you learn from other people who have got theirs going? So we did start that program almost right away, and it's completely free and anybody can do it.
This reminds me of something. I've taught for the Colson Center for years. There was a program called the Centurions, now known as the Colson Fellows. One of the guys, in order to be commissioned, you have to have a 3-year plan for ministry. And one of the guys came up with what he called pig fests. And a pig fest was you invite a group of people, preferably a diverse group of people, to your house. And every one of them, you set a timer. Every one of them does a presentation on anything they want to, and you give them, let's say, 10 minutes, and then you've got 20 minutes of discussion of this, and then the timer goes off, and that subject is now off limits. You then move to the next.
Interesting.
Topic. And they called it pig fests because they would have food in between conversations or finger food during them and all of this sort of thing. And he used to do this with groups. I mean, I don't remember what the timing was, but he used to do, I think they were a little shorter than half hour, but he used to do this with groups of like 8 to 10 people. And they would just kind of go all afternoon. And everybody would have a chance to have their say. Everybody would have a chance to have a discussion or debate or argument. Yep. And then it was over. And then you move on to the next.
Interesting.
Yeah. One of the things I was just thinking about when you were mentioning the way these conversations and the dynamics are taking place is, it's something I find, I'm teaching some undergrads right now. I do this every term. And of course, I love lecturing. That's part of why I do teaching. And oftentimes I learn more through the lecturing process because I'm processing and having to communicate it. But I often wonder how much the student is. I mean, I always learned quite a bit from them, but not everyone learns that way. And it's during the review process, like I was having today, where I allow them kind of to digest it and then ask their questions back. And that's where you really find out what they're taking or not. And that's where they will actually begin to ask more and more questions because they feel safe in that moment to finally say, you know what, well, what do you mean by this? Because I need to prepare for this. And the conversations turn good, even from the teacher's side at that point. So it almost is a way of breaking down some of the formality that can wrap itself around learning and allow the other part of it, the response part of it and interactive part of it to take on a life of its own.
Part of the pushback that I've gotten from churches is that they'll look at this and they'll say, well, there's no clear presentation of the gospel. And I'll say, well, that's true. There isn't. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of the value of this in terms of pastoral care.
Yeah.
Because as a local church pastor, certainly you're caring for the flock of, let's say, the members that gather. And then there's this next ring of attenders and people, let's say, related to the members of your church that gather. And then there's other people sort of out there in the community that you wind up over time building a relationship with. What I like about this is that you get the people talking to one another. And you begin to build the relationships and the friendships between the people early on. One of the things, so before the internet stuff happened to me, when I came to Sacramento, I met with another CRC pastor who had planted a church near here. Sacramento was growing, and so we decided we were going to have a pretty aggressive church planting program. And one of the things we had almost all of our church planters do, or would-be church planters, is say, okay, well, I want you to have 500 conversations in a coffee shop with total strangers and find out what you learn about that neighborhood, because you need to know the people and you need to know their issues. And I was always a bit jealous because I love that kind of engagement, but sort of as an established church pastor, again, not getting enough of it. And so when we first did the Jordan Peterson meetup, a bunch of people started watching my videos. They're like, well, let's do a meetup. And I thought, no one will come. And people did come. And then people kept coming. And so then I got the sense that a lot of people were watching things on YouTube. They were watching Jordan Peterson, and they'd say, I was watching Jordan Peterson. I had all these ideas. And then I went to my wife and said, and she's like, I don't want to talk to you about that. And we actually had a lot of people in the group like that.
Sure, yeah.
And so there are a lot of meetup.com groups out there. But from what I hear from people who find us, let's say through meetup.com and come to our groups, is that most groups are someone's always selling something. It's their ideology, it's their philosophy, or their religion.
Yeah.
And what's refreshing for them is here they have a place where they're listened to, where they're valued, where they can build a relationship. And again, as a pastor, that's gold. And it might be a very long time before, but in time they become quite church curious.
Yeah.
Well, getting to that, I mean, I think the Jordan Peterson angle is important because obviously he's unaffiliated. He's a guy who's, just talking about larger, I guess, questions that maybe don't get asked in other settings. So. And you can feel like you're getting just to the edge of, say, theology proper, but never really kind of stepping over the line with him. It's Jungian, it's psychological, it's working with archetypes. And I find all that stuff interesting and pretty cool to think about. But that provides the estuary that you're talking about. In other words, all the people coming together with all these different thoughts and questions. And I imagine as a pastor, you've got to be evaluating yourself in terms of how those conversations go, where people find where they end up, whether they come to Christ or they don't or whatever. So I imagine there's a lot of I guess, ambiguity that you're having to deal with?
There always is as a pastor.
And nothing new with that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take unchurched people to bring that ambiguity into your life.
It seems to me there are two things that are going on here that are really valuable about the estuary model for pastors. First of all, okay, there's no clear presentation of the gospel, but sometimes people aren't ready to hear the gospel. So you have to do what Schaeffer called pre-evangelism. And he did it differently, but this is one way of doing that. But the second thing is that if you do it, what I would guess is if you do it right, you're actually going to be bringing in non-Christians who might never darken the door of your church.
Well, that's exactly right.
So I know pastors who seem to spend their entire time of necessity ministering to their congregants. Yeah. So they don't actually interact with the lost, the unbelievers in their community a whole lot. This is a vehicle to do that. That's right. And it performs a pre-evangelistic function, and as well as others. I mean, that's not the only thing it's doing. But
and with a good nod to the Reformed tradition, it isn't really pre-gospel at all. The gospel is about creation, the fall, redemption. It's part of it. And usually you're dealing with the part that we have creatures that are fallen. And it's that part of it. So it isn't outside of the gospel. It's part of the heart of it. It's just this stuff has been so eclipsed culturally now, and it's kind of post-Christian in many ways, even though these ideas linger and they morph and they end up in Jungian types and things like that. But on the other side, those are places where they still can show up, and that's where they can become an entrance way to redirect the shape of the conversation. And so I think oftentimes that kind of redemptive historical model allows that not to be. I know oftentimes we think of the gospel strictly as getting to the redemptive Christ point, but that's tied to all the rest. And I think that's where I think oftentimes we miss that. We often present the gospel into a void rather than into a world of creatures, and to creatures that are right now experiencing life this way. And the gospel has something to say to it. And what you're doing is you're peeling back the way in which creatures are experiencing life right now and finding that entrance way to where redemption hits it. I hope I got that right.
But this brings to mind something, related to Neil Postman. You brought up Postman a little while back. And you're working in a new medium. We might think of it as just television, with democratized television. We can all be, Walter Cronkite now, that kind of thing. But it's not. I mean, it's a different thing.
Just kidding.
Right,
I know.
But it's a different thing. And I think many of us, when we approach a new medium, we bring with us the kind of the disciplines of the old one. And so you end up with a lot of online sermons and, things like that, or even interviews like we're doing with you. But you're doing something, I think, that I don't think could have ever been done without YouTube.
So Estuary is sort of the in-person manifestation of this. The online manifestation of it is sort of called This Little Corner of the Internet. And that kind of came out of a lot of what was happening in 2023, 2024. And that has also been sort of using YouTube in some ways, both as it originally was supposed to be used, but also not the way it's flowing, because a lot of YouTube attempts to be, like you said, sort of television 2.0. We're going to have sets. We're going to use this. We're going to use these liturgies from television and just use them on YouTube. And a lot of what we've done, especially with these randos conversations, because a lot of YouTube channels will sort of build their brand by getting higher and higher status, bigger and bigger names in for interviews, and they just go interview for the interview. And I find those conversations actually rather dull, because generally speaking, the talking heads say the same thing at every point. Yeah. And I found it far more interesting to actually talk to normal people, randos. And I think as a pastor, while our culture is being deeply shaped by what's on social media and what's on the screens. If you really want to have an understanding of, let's say, what's going on in your locality, or what's probably a little ahead of the curve, because by the time there's an article written about it or a book written about it, it's probably already months old in the culture.
Yeah.
And so even though you really have to listen carefully, you're actually better off talking to normal people to get a sense of what's coming down the road. And then if you can create a space where people can be having these conversations up front. Part of the difficulty of being a pastor and preparing sermons is that so many of your best sermon illustrations you can't use because they're all coming out of your pastoral ministry.
Right, that's right. And Bob over there, who's having a really tough time in his marriage.
Exactly. But when people are volunteering their information out on the internet and social media, it's like, oh, yeah, I can talk about you because you've already shared it with the internet. So
that's right. Right.
I need to apologize, Paul, because you are actually not having a conversation with normal people right now.
I've watched your podcast. I know.
We used to be Pugs.
But another feature, of course, to YouTube, and I'm not very good at keeping in touch with it, is the comment section. You know, if you're really working the comment section, that's from a standpoint of a producer, that's a good way to build your audience. But even beyond that, it's where the initial contact happens, and you're actually interacting with people. Like Walter Cronkite, typical in an old-fashioned there was no way to do that. You could send a letter, and who knows if it ever got to him. But and then it's pretty close to real time. You can see stuff and how things are being received. Within minutes after posting an interview or a show or whatever. So that's another feature to this that's worth thinking about.
And it can be cultivated because you can use that comment section for community. I know for many YouTube channels, the comment section looks like a dumpster fire. I had a conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield from the UK, and she noted when I had her on the channel, she was like, usually when I do videos, people are just barking about ideological things. But actually in your comment section, people know each other.
Yeah.
And so, again, part of the Randos conversations and then the in-person things was to get people out of the comment section and then onto the screen, because it's one thing to complain about a comment because of some political valence or religious valence, but it's another thing when you've actually begun in a slight way to develop a little bit of a relationship with that person. And
right.
You know them more broadly. And then suddenly, okay, they're a Republican, they're a Democrat, they like Trump, they hate Trump, but
right.
There's these other aspects that I know about them.
Yeah, I think that's great. And like I said, I don't do this, and I don't know if I can, but at the same time, it's a great thing to do if you can.
Yeah.
My son is always trying to get us to interact in the comment sections more.
and people will comment right away. I mean, that's like Chris had mentioned. And so it is kind of fresh response to what you're talking about. And you do want to know, how are people receiving this? And is it generating that kind of, stuff? So yeah, that's what I call ahead of the game, thinking through how to actually get those kind of conversations connected.
Yeah, one of the things I was looking into this little corner, and one of the things that struck me, or the question that came up in my mind, was how do you even start something like that?
Right.
I don't know, because I didn't intend to start it and it just happened.
Yeah.
But there are a few things, and I think one of the things is honesty.
Right.
You have to be honest about your own shortcomings and the shortcomings, let's say, of your tradition.
Right. Now, the Reformed tradition doesn't have any shortcomings. You know that, Paul.
Neither do the Anglicans.
But I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you want to be welcome at a table. So this is one of the things I've shared with people who were wondering how to become a writer or whatever, and I tell them, be the token. If you want to be the 500,000th person to comment on the Gospel Coalition, go for it. But how about being like the only Reformed guy in the room? And you're valued for that. Because you bring something that maybe wouldn't be ever mentioned without you being there.
Yeah.
And
I've been surprised how diverse this has been. I mean, we've got obviously orthobros, trad caths, more politically liberal. It tended to lean conservative because we're sort of downstream from Jordan Peterson. But people, if given the chance, will show up in good faith if they have a reasonable expectation that they'll be heard and taken seriously. They don't necessarily need to be agreed with.
Yeah,
I think that's great. Now, that I think implies that there are certain disciplines that everybody can exercise. In other words, self-control for one, and not a need to always win. I think that's another thing. There's a sense that people have that if I haven't won, then it was a waste of time or something. But if you have a longer term perspective, and if it's not really about winning anyway, I mean, what we should be striving for in any kind of dialogue, even if we call it a debate, is the truth. And so, if you think about it, there's really no way to lose if you're actually pursuing the truth. So, like if you're wrong and you're corrected, you actually win. But that's not the way we feel.
No.
Especially if you're from New Jersey.
Well, I like people disagreeing with me. I mean, in some ways, I don't think they're being honest with me until they actually tell me what they think.
Yeah,
right.
So,
yeah, right.
That's right. Yeah. And you learn as well. Sometimes our way of putting things needs refining, and maybe we're wrong. It does happen more often than not. And then it's interesting though. I was thinking the other day, some of the kind of unexpected. We would expect it, but sometimes I'll drop off. Chris knows this place, J. Timothy's, best wings in Connecticut.
Oh yeah.
But I'll go for lunch, sit at the bar, have a beer or two, and usually there's always a few gentlemen there. This is their day to meet up, and they will invite you into their conversation. Yeah, they've loosened up a little, I'm sure. A lot of them are.
Yeah, it's good beer there. That helps.
Great beer there. And I met a guy. He's a carpenter by living, getting up close to retirement. But they have all these same kind of big questions that nobody talks to them. So they're going here for that. And I end up having both get Matthew Crawford's book, right? Shop Class for Soulcraft, and using it. They write me back. They're like, we're going every Thursday. They want to meet now. And it's this kind of thing. They just want to talk about something that has spiritual depth. They don't know how to put their finger on it. And they don't even know where to look. And of course, you just go in, okay, here, I'm going to open this passage. Yeah, they'd probably listen to me once. But if I can build that trust with them and show how these things are pointing to creation and that it's wired a certain way, and there's a reason why it's wired that way, and there's a reason why it likes to unwire itself, and then there is a reason for hope. But
here's the thing that you did though, Tom, is you pointed them to a resource you knew they would be interested in.
Yes,
Crawford Shop Class of Soulcraft.
They were asking spiritual questions, and they love working with their hands.
Right. Now, unfortunately, a lot of pastors don't read broadly. In other words, they're just focused narrowly in on their sermon prep, and if they're reading outside of that narrow, they're just looking for sermon illustrations. They're not actually reading because they're interested in anything.
Yeah,
they're just looking for that. But if you're the sort of person who has broad interest and you spend time in these, the term that people are using now is third spaces. I don't know if that rings a bell. But it sounds like what you've got online, Paul, is something like a third space.
Yeah. And and this is, I always tell people, I'm a very selfish YouTuber. If you know you need a third space, and if you can successfully build one, that brings the people to you.
Yeah.
Well, as a pastor, that's just efficient.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I don't have to go to Starbucks or any place. They're coming to me because of the internet.
Right.
And then it's also efficient because as a pastor, you also know that a key is distributing into the congregation. If everyone who walks through that door, if I need to have a one-on-one relationship with everyone who walks through that door, and the relationship never goes beyond me, I have failed as a pastor.
Yeah.
Right.
What they need to be is woven into the rest of the church.
Yeah.
And again, in an estuary context, suddenly they have friends. And if they, in fact, do stay for the service after church, guess what? They will have someone to talk to after church. They're not going to run out that door or feel isolated or alone. You've already built friends into the church for them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, have you? I mean, we kind of noticed this even early on. Have you started to get stuff just from all over the world writing you?
Absolutely.
And the range of reach is incredible.
Yeah, and that's how this crazy thing started, because my church is small and people would write me a heartfelt email and I write them back. And very quickly, as you know, again, as a pastor, you can't do a lot via email.
Yeah.
You really want to talk to them. In person would be best, but over Zoom is better than email.
Yeah.
And that's how this thing started. And I think, the question of expectation and setting a table, again, I didn't plan on this, but because I am a pastor and I've had years of pastoral conversations with people, those recorded conversations gave people sort of a voyeuristic window into the pastor's study. And a lot of expectations that they had, which were wrong, were suddenly set aside. They're like, well, it's Jordan Hall, who became a Christian recently, he and his wife are there and they went to church a couple times. And so they asked their friend, you think the pastor would be willing to talk to me? And, as a pastor, it's like, we're dying to talk to you. But part of what the internet does is explode that. So just like I know in church, when someone comes in, I'm going to have to distribute their relational capital within the congregation. When this started online, I knew I was going to have to develop an online community, because I don't have enough time, in addition to everything else I do, just pay attention to a few thousand people. And so I need other people on screens and on channels that if they can't find me, then they'll be closer friends with these other people than they will be with me.
It seems to me that you must have a sympathetic and supportive church for what you're doing, and it would be really hard to do it if that wasn't the case. And it's not common to have a sympathetic and supportive church for this sort of thing. So I'm curious to know how it developed.
Well, the church had always been open. So this church, it's in a declining neighborhood. The church itself is aging and declining. And so that put less pressure on me. And so I had been involved with church planting. I'd been involved with denominational work. And then when this thing came along, Paul had always done other things. And so I started doing that. And then when donations started coming in and visitors started coming in, then the church is like, oh, do more of that, because the donations and the visitors, that they like.
That'll win them over.
That's right. So yeah, the church has always been very, very supportive of it. And, and actually, I think there's a lot of pastors in small and declining churches. And it's like, what are you doing with your time? This is something that you can actually help your church with. When we had to repave the parking lot, which is something that, when you look at what that bill's going to be in the church, and if the church is already sort of like this, it just made one appeal to the internet, and wow, $30,000 for the parking lot.
That was the number that popped into my head as soon as you said that. I've done that.
Wow.
So if one of our listeners out there is interested in this, you talked about training for Estuary Hub and that sort of thing, but suppose they just want to find a little bit about the online communities, this little corner. How would they go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a little harder because I haven't centralized anything. And what's interesting about the online space is you're valued by, it's not, again, unlike a local church. People look at church, they're hard to get in. It's like, no, actually, if you come like 3 or 4 Sundays in a row, and when they ask for volunteers for something, if you volunteer, whether or not you believe anything anybody else believes, that little church will hold you as their own. They really will.
Yeah.
And so in the online space, it's similar. And so for a lot of, we sort of have this tradition of kind of coming out of the lurk. And part of what has happened in this little corner on the internet is a lot of the channels, and most of them are fairly small, they do open live streams where they'll drop a link in the comment section in StreamYard. You just have to click it. And then now suddenly you're one of the squares in the Hollywood squares. And people are going to ask about you, and they're going to ask what you think. And so for a lot of people, it's been, they find a live stream and then they click on that link and then they begin to talk. And then once they're sort of seen and they're recognized, now suddenly there'll be a little bit more curiosity. And then usually one of the smaller channels will say, let's do a randos with you. And a randos is basically an introductory conversation where they will come on. And, you know, again, I sort of established the liturgy for this, just people watching me, and just pastorally, a good opening question is, tell me about the home you grew up in. And that then.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of how people come out of the lurk. But a lot of people, again, with YouTube, for every 1,000 people watching, 10 people will leave a comment, and, you know, just an even smaller group will come out of the lurk. But and then kind of as it grows, then people will sort of start their own channel and they'll start doing a similar thing. And so then that network, it's sort of like the other channels in the flotilla in the corner, they're sort of like the small groups. And that's sort of how those church dynamics have happened on the internet.
It's a good set of numbers that you provided in terms of what to expect. So 1,000 equals 10, and out of but the thing about that is there are just a lot of folks who are either because of the way they're wired or because they're afraid of how they'll be received are just watching, but those folks can be getting a lot out of it, and you just don't know that what's going on. But anyway, that's all good to know. By the way, there's some music in the background. My wife teaches piano, and she just started a lesson.
Very nice.
Well, there might be music in the background here too. I'm at church, and they're going to practice in a little bit, so gotcha. I get it. And that's also sort of where the in-person events come from. Go to, because YouTube is very visual, and women in particular have reasons for being a little bit more reluctant to come online and show their face in terms of how they'll be received and what's at stake. I'll often tell people that YouTube is a place for people without much to lose.
Yeah.
And so then when we do in-person conferences, a lot of the women will come out in those spaces because now they've got a little bit more control.
Yeah.
And in terms of our in real life estuary meetings, generally speaking, not recorded. There's no notes taken. What's said in the room, for the most part, usually stays in the room. And so, again, that's also part of kind of the idea of the in-person conferences where we scale them down, because especially in this age of, I mean, you guys had a great lineup for your Touchstone conference. I hadn't heard about your conference until about a year ago, but it's a lineup after my own heart. I have relationships with many of those people. But so many conferences you go to and you listen to these ideas, and then at some point you ask yourself, could I have gotten the same thing just watching it on YouTube? So what I'd really rather is they go to a conference and they leave the conference with a new friend or with a new group, or maybe even with the beginnings of an estuary meeting. So that's the reason we sort of, I haven't planned any conferences myself yet. I basically invited people to plan them, to go on a limb with them, and then I'll support you in whatever way I can. Maybe I'll show up, maybe, but then we have conferences in different places around the world. So that's how we're trying to multiply the groups and the conferences.
Yeah, organizing conferences is a lot of work. It's very wise to have somebody else do it for you.
So you noted that you have them all over the place now. So can you give us a sense of maybe some conferences that are coming up that folks would be maybe able to attend?
Well, the next big one is Estuary, and that's going to be in Lake Junealaska, North Carolina. And that's coming up in a few weeks. In November, there are 3 estuary events so then some of these people who are sort of downstream from us, they brand in their own way. So the Europeans have Breakwater, which is, sort of estuary adjacent. And so there's an event coming up in London and one coming up in the Netherlands and another one in Germany. And so those are the ones on offer. But at any given time, there's always, because it's sort of crowdsourced, the conferences too, I know Texas and Minneapolis are both sort of yearning to get one going. New York City, maybe in a couple of years. So a lot of those people, they're talking to me or they're talking to some of the estuary people saying, I'd really like to do a conference. And then part of what has happened is because I'm a Christian Reformed minister, I can usually sort of help them find space in a Christian Reformed church. And so many of them have been in Christian Reformed churches.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
So when it comes to that, are you working outside of the kind of the Reformed world at all in terms of other clerics and other traditions who are wanting to connect with you?
So last year I did an event in Galway, Ireland with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw, and the Roman Catholics organized that one. I did one in DC a couple of years ago with Michael Martin and Spencer Clavin. That again was organized by a couple of Roman Catholics. I'm going to be in Austin in 2026 talking to a group of Orthodox priests, which is the strangest thing that I never thought would happen, but here we are. So, yeah, and that's, again, sort of the way that this has emerged. Like one of the driving forces of the Midwestuary that we just had in Chicago is a Unitarian layman he's a biblical Unitarian, so he sort of grew up with evangelicals, but he's not UU. So it has been extraordinarily broad in terms of who organizes and what happens.
This brings back the idea that you need to be kind of good on your feet, and you have to have a little bit of knowledge about a lot of different things, including other, theological traditions, and maybe even have a sympathetic approach where you say, you guys have some strengths, and we can work together. Man, we don't agree with about everything, but that's a given. But what are the things that we can work together on?
And that's why even Estuary, I've always said, at a conference, people are like, Estuary is my church.
Yeah. I know.
Estuary
it can get weird.
Church. Yes, Estuary is church adjacent. That is where I'm locating it. Okay. So, and then other people are like, what if people speak heresy in Estuary? It's like, I hear plenty of heresy in church too, but
that's right. That's right. Yeah. That's very true.
Yeah. So C.S. Lewis's hallway and rooms have sort of been a good metaphor. John Vervaeke has had his Silk Road. So that's the way we're trying to both honor the fact that people come from different places, but also create an estuary, an intermediate space where we can have productive conversations.
Well, and it's interesting the range of thinkers, because a lot of times they're emphasizing something that has been left out from the Christian emphasis. I mean, I think the Michael Martin you're talking about is one that does the sophology and the metaphysics.
Yep.
So he's emphasizing those lost dimensions of wisdom at the heart of things and the wisdom traditions and their philosophical implications that are lost now to the West that Christians cultivated. And so that's left out. And so if we're not including it in some way, we're missing out on a lot of those dimensions people are knowing should be there, but they can't find.
Yep.
Sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to.
No, that's all on point. I guess, if you're skeptical or if you're kind of maybe purist, and you're wondering, well, doesn't this sort of trend to a kind of lowest common denominator kind of dynamic? How would you respond to that objection?
I think the common denominator we have is we would like to meet with other people and talk about things. That is our denominator. So we've had some interesting requests for Estuary. Requests, can the military use this to help people with PTSD? Guess so. We had, which the funniest thing was downstream from Jordan Peterson, we had a corporation ask to license it for their diversity, equity, and inclusion groups. And yeah, you could use it for that. I mean, the protocol is it's astoundingly open, and you can use it for anything. But, I never. So I grew up in New Jersey. My father was a CRC minister pastoring in an African-American congregation in the Christian Reformed Church. And what I saw him model was sort of a fearless openness. You're going to say what you're going to say, and I can listen to you and I can learn from it. It doesn't mean that I'm threatened. I already know who I am. And so many bad conversations are because people don't know who they are. And so when they hear something, it threatens them. And it's like, what you say doesn't threaten me.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I think if you ask, but I'll probably mostly listen to you because, truth be told, if I'm talking too much, you won't listen anyway.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I think that's one of the things that, we've had this recent, terrible event with Charlie Kirk, and I didn't really follow him at all. He was somebody I knew about. You couldn't miss it. If you have spent any time online. But I had people in my church that I discovered really followed him closely. But of course, after the event, after the killing, I got to see a little bit of his approach to things, and he did listen. He was a guy who would listen. He would formulate his response, and he didn't appear to be. He was unflappable, or pretty close to unflappable, and that kind of ability to stay clear-headed and on your feet is something I think we should all try to aspire to.
No, I think so.
Yeah, and the other thing about Kirk that I think actually connects on some level to the Estuary is when people came in, he paid attention to who they are, where their pain points were, those kinds of things, and actually, in many cases, if the person seemed to be open to it, he was actually remarkably pastoral in terms of how he dealt with them. And it seems to me that within the Estuary context, that's probably the kind of thing you're most likely to deal with, the pain points in people's lives, and giving people a chance to talk about them, to discuss them, to get other perspectives on them. That's just incredibly valuable.
Yeah. And it's, people say things like, well, you're different from pastors. And I think I'm not a lot different from many pastors I know. Most pastors, you can go into their office and pour out your heart, and good pastors will listen before trying to shove something down your throat. And the church is full of good listeners. And this is something that the church isn't necessarily known for, but probably should be.
Right.
That's an interesting thought, because I wonder when it comes to that, is it just because we're not very good at getting, our strengths recognized by people who are outside? Or is it because maybe a few bad apples, sort of like color, ruin it for the rest of us? Or is it just that the people that immediately assume the worst are actually afraid and just are kind of reading in their fears to give them an excuse not to talk?
Or stereotypes or any number of things, yeah.
All the above.
Right.
Yeah.
My pastor every Tuesday goes to Fiddler's Hearth, which is an Irish pub in the area, and does what he calls pastor in the pub. And he holds his office hours there. It's a time for open conversation, anybody who wants to show up. And then he finishes it up usually with a group that wants to go through a book with him. So he'll then have a book discussion. But he gets a lot of people who aren't in the church, people from the neighborhood who've gotten to know him, that kind of thing, who show up and just engage.
Does he put up a shingle or something? Is it? How do people know that it's Pastor in a Pub moment?
Well, it's word of mouth. He advertises it in the church, but it's word of mouth primarily. And the pub knows him. And, so they have a table that he goes to, and that's where it's going to be held. And actually, his name's Peter Wallace. He's a descendant of William Wallace. Actually, yeah, really. And so he asked them at one point to give him, French fries with cheese and bacon and things like that on it. And this became, it's not on the menu, but if you go in and ask for Wallace fries, that's what you're going to get.
You never know what'll happen.
I don't think Peter would mind me telling you any of this stuff. But that isn't an estuary, but it's sort of in the spirit of it.
Yeah. Well, we should wrap things up here. This has been a great conversation. It's great to hear about your work there, Paul, and how things have prospered. And is there any way that people can learn about, I think we'll put a link to your YouTube channel in the show notes. Is there anything else that you'd encourage people to check out in order to learn more about what you're doing?
If they're curious about Estuary, they can just go to estuaryhub.com, and there are videos down there, and there's links if they want to find an estuary near them. They're all over the world right now, but the world is a very big place, so don't know how close it might be to any given person.
Right.
But they can find estuaries if they're interested in becoming an estuary leader or starting a group. They can get into that leadership training program if they want, and they can take it from there. Otherwise, they can go to my YouTube channel and leave a comment. Or if you leave a comment enough, people will begin to notice you and begin conversations with you.
Yeah, neat. Well, again, thank you for coming on the show. It's been great
pleasure
to have you. And we really do encourage everybody who's listened in today or watched us on YouTube or are listening to us in the car or whatever to, take the effort to check all that stuff out and get to know what Paul is up to and all the things that are kind of coming out of that. That's great. And we want to thank, too, all the folks out there who support us through Patreon. If you'd like to join that intrepid band, there is going to be another link in the show notes, and that'll take you to that, our Patreon page, and we'd appreciate your support if you can give it. All right, well, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.